Afternoon. Like Roger, I think I feel more comfortable speaking from the floor. But clearly, if I'm speaking too fast, please let me know. If I'm speaking too slow, also let me know. But not too many boos and hisses, please. Quite close there. So we've talked already about this VUCA world, and the phrase came from American military, and perhaps not so appropriate to education. And I think Professor Pant has given us a different definition of VUCA, which is perhaps more relevant to us in the world of education. So it's a visible, unbounding, challenging, and awesome world. Really a world that we embrace. And I'm going to talk to you a little about this leadership in this world. So the good thing about education is that we're all leaders, whether we're running large institutions, whether we're running large departments, or whether we're just running our classrooms. The bad thing about education is that leadership doesn't tend to be that effective in many areas. And for those who don't believe me, talk to me later. I can give you plenty of examples of where leadership in education falls down. So what we'll try to do is just maybe give some tips and hints on how to approach leadership in your area. So these are the kind of basics that you need to take forward. You need to anticipate what you're doing. You need to understand the consequences of any new project. Appreciate the interdependencies of variables. Prepare for alternatives. And interpret and address the relevant opportunities. All very basic stuff about how often do I actually put that into practice. And certainly if we are in the role of managing teams, I think it's very important that we look at our team members and we actually measure what they can do in terms of their day-to-day management of new projects. And we can actually measure whether people actually are taking things forward in terms of areas like knowledge management, planning, process management, responsiveness, the forward practices, and very important, learning from failures. We don't often in education allow people to fail, but it's certainly in the corporate world, it's finding that people are becoming more and more interested in this. How do people actually, how do they develop their resilience? How do they take forward any setbacks? Quite often in education we don't like that to happen. So that there's the basic building blocks for the management. But what I wanted to really talk about in the next 10 minutes or so is just a few practical examples of the different ideas you might want to take forward when you're bringing in a new project into your school, whether you're developing a new team, whether it's a completely new government initiative. This phrase anti-fragile, which seems quite an odd phrase. What's this to do with education? And I think if you look in a gardening sense, if you take your seeds and you plant them carefully and you water them carefully and you protect them, and the first frosts come along and the plants quite often die because we've overprotected. Now what happens if actually we take these same seeds and we throw them in the ground, we don't water them very much, we cut them back very hard, what happens when the frost comes? Well, they probably die anyway. But I think the point being that if they don't die, then they come back much, much stronger. So is that an area, is that an issue that we can apply when we're taking projects forward in education? Probably not one that's used very often, but certainly it's becoming a more interesting idea, this idea of anti-fragile. How do we develop that resilience within our projects? How do we develop that idea of resilience in our leadership? If we don't take maybe a more robust attitude to some of our projects and protect them too much, then they're going to die anyway. Another phrase that's come from America, the skin in the game. Now I think this is probably refers to kind of professional sport, saying that really if you're not willing to get your knees damaged, if you're not willing to get your nose broken, then you're not really taking it seriously. It's a very kind of American phrase, and you can see in some ways how it fits into corporate world. In the education world, we're clearly not all motivated by money. We're not all motivated by share options, etc. But we should care about the projects that we're involved in, and the teams of people that we get to take on these projects have to care about them. It has to be important. If it's not important to them, then the chances of success, I think, are very slim. Certainly in the UK, some of the head teachers I'm most respected, they will see a number of government initiatives come across their desk, and the view is that quite often, if it doesn't affect them personally, it's something they hope that will go away, something that will move on. So they don't have that skin in the game. And quite often in education, my experience in working in government agencies in the Middle East, in the UK, and other areas, is that top-down approaches very rarely succeed, because back to this idea of the skin in the game. We haven't really engaged the full team. Does this really matter if this is successful? If your project doesn't matter, why do it in the first place? The negative world. It's a similar idea, again, of the skin in the game. If you're going to approach a project feeling that it's negative, if your team are approaching it feeling it's negative, the chances of success, I think, are very, very slim. And I think we need to try and avoid that approach if at all possible. This was actually, when I was doing some research on this, was quite a new one in me, and it was quite an interesting idea. The Lindy effect is, again, an American idea, whereby they've noticed that technology tends to persist. So the longer that a technology or process exists in your organization, the harder it is to change, which is sort of quite surprising. We think again in this new world that new technologies, new ideas will replace existing processes. But to give an example of that, in the UK, at an examination body, we could offer our schools new computer-based assessments, which are much simpler, probably much more effective, certainly much more cost-effective, perhaps I think more valid, more reliable, or we could offer the paper-based. And what do you think the schools opted for? Yep, they went for the paper-based tests, because that was tried and tested, and that was something they knew. And to change a technology, to change an existing process, will actually take you a lot longer than you would expect. Another idea you might want to think of taking forward is this idea of a barbell strategy. And to give an example of that, there's a school I was advising in the UK recently, appointed a head teacher at the age of 35. Now in the UK, that's very young. Typically, you would be 45, perhaps 50, before you're taking on that role. So this was a bold initiative by the governing body. But the barbell strategy says you should try and balance that out. If you're going to do something very, very exciting and at the same time you need to think of how can you balance that out. And what they did in that situation was recognize some of the senior management team who already were experienced in that area and gave them special recognition. I think without using that barbell strategy, the chances of the young head succeeding would have been very difficult. So again, these are just simple kind of ideas you might want to think about in terms of your own projects. The green lumber fallacy. There was a very famous stock trader who made a lot of money out of dealing in green lumber, and he was regarded as the expert in green lumber. The point of this was that he actually didn't know what green lumber was. He just assumed it was lumber that was painted green. He didn't understand it was immature forestry rather than dried timber. What I want to get across here is that sometimes we look at reports, we look at data, we look at statistics, and we think we know the answer very quickly. We think we understand all the issues behind it. So let's try and put this in an educational context. You may come across a young teacher in your school who's getting very, very good results. On paper, the data shows that his students are progressing very well. They've achieved great results in a particular test. But unless you understand the full picture, you can really be misguided on that. It's something I want you to try and think in the broader picture. And clearly as educationists, we understand the full aspect of learning and not just be taken in by one particular data interpretation. And if we get it right, we end up with a rather Goldilocks and Three Bears scenario. where it's our new project is going forward, and it's neither too hot, it's neither too cold, it's just the right temperature. It's neither too challenging, if it is challenging enough, it feels comfortable. And that, I think, in an education thing is where we want to try and be. Very hard to do, because we appreciate this is a very complex world. Education is difficult. It's a lot harder than making products in a factory. It can be a lot harder than devising software programs. If we knew all the answers to education, then I think we would be moving forward a lot faster. So it's a very complex world. And this butterfly effect, which I'm sure is a phrase you've heard before on many times, that very small changes in your environment can have big impacts. Impacts that perhaps you haven't understood, impacts that you need to take care of and take forward. And I'm going to leave you with this slide. I think you've heard enough from us today. But this is let's just talk a little about Thales and who he was. He was a Greek philosopher. I think he was the first century. Professor Pant, was he first century? First century BC? Good. What was he famous for? Well, he's famous for a number of things, but one of the things he certainly did do, he created the first futures contract. So he allowed grain farmers to take advantage of being able to sell their crops at a time in the future. The point I want to get across there is that Thales was not a farmer. He didn't know anything about growing grain. He didn't really know where this whole thing was taking. But what he could do was create a structure which allowed the financial bankers to take advantage of the system of trade. It allowed our farmers to have certainty in terms of their crop production. And he without knowing the detail of where things were going, and we don't really know where our students will be heading in the future. But if we can provide some structures, if we can provide some frameworks which allow them to move forward, and I think we've done our job effectively as leaders in education. Thank you very much for your attention, and that's what I want to talk to you today.